Some doors were never meant to open. And yet, in the gray waters of New York Harbor, there was a place where millions of doors swung wide and millions more remained forever closed. Picture yourself drifting back now through the soft curtain of time to an island that held both the brightest dreams and the quietest sorrows of an entire century. The year is 1907. The salt air carries the distant sound of foghorns, and somewhere beyond the morning mist, the silhouette of Lady Liberty raises her torch above the harbor. But your eyes are not drawn to her tonight. Instead, they rest upon the red brick towers of Ellis Island, rising from the water like a cathedral built for the hopeful and the weary. Feel the weight of history around you as we begin this journey together. More than 12 million souls passed through these halls between 1892 and 1954. 12 million hearts beating with hope, with fear, with the quiet determination of those who had left everything behind. And yet, for every story of triumph, there was another that ended in ways no one likes to remember. Tonight, we will walk through the forgotten corridors of this island, where the walls still hold whispers that most visitors never hear. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on, like the tides that have always surrounded this place. Let yourself settle deeper now, as we travel back to the very first day this island opened its doors. January 1st, 1892. A cold wind swept across the harbor as the steamship Nevada sat anchored in the gray morning light. On its deck stood a 17-year-old girl from County Cork, Ireland, her red hair tucked beneath a worn woolen shawl. Her name was Annie Moore, and in just a few hours, she would become the first immigrant ever processed at the brand-new Ellis Island immigration station. Imagine the sounds of that morning: the creak of wooden hulls against the dock, the murmur of hundreds of voices speaking in languages that blended together like a strange and beautiful music, the nervous shuffle of feet on wet planks as families gathered their belongings and prepared to step into a future they could not see. Annie had spent 12 days at sea with her two younger brothers, crossing the Atlantic in the cramped quarters of steerage class. They had left Ireland to reunite with their parents, who had sailed to America 2 years earlier. Now, as the ferry carried them toward the island, Annie could see the enormous pine building that would decide their fate. Slowly, the scene shifts to the interior of the main hall. The first Ellis Island was nothing like the grand brick structure that stands today. It was built entirely of wood, its walls made of Georgia pine, its ceilings open and airy. Government officials had designed it to process thousands of immigrants each day, but no one truly knew what that would look like. On this first morning, roughly 700 people would pass through its doors. Annie Moore walked up the gangplank and into history. A registrar named Charles Hendley wrote her name in careful script at the top of the very first page of the very first registry book. Then Colonel John Weber, the federal superintendent of immigration, stepped forward with a gift. He pressed a $10 gold coin into Annie's palm and wished her a happy new year. It was more money than she had ever held in her life, the largest sum she had ever possessed. In the gentle flow of time, that moment has become legend. Statues of Annie Moore now stand both at Ellis Island and in Cove, Ireland, her port of departure. Songs have been written about her. But the truth of Annie's life, like so many immigrant stories, was far more complicated than the fairy tale version. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as we follow Annie's path. She never left New York City. She married a German-American baker's clerk named Joseph Scheer, and together they had 11 children. But only 5 survived to adulthood. Annie spent her entire adult life in a series of cramped tenements on the Lower East Side, just a few blocks from the Fulton Fish Market where her husband worked. When she died of heart failure in 1924, at the age of 50, she was buried in an unmarked grave at Calvary Cemetery in Queens. For decades, historians believed a different Annie Moore, one who had traveled west to Texas and died beneath the wheels of a streetcar, was the same girl who had first stepped onto Ellis Island. It was not until 2006 that genealogists finally discovered the truth. The real Annie had never strayed far from the harbor where her American journey began. She had lived the typical hard-scrabble immigrant life, filled with struggle and loss, joy and endurance. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. And if Annie's story seems both ordinary and extraordinary at once, that is because it was. Millions of others would follow her through those doors, each carrying their own burdens, their own hopes, their own secrets. But the island itself would soon develop secrets of its own. Picture yourself walking through the original wooden buildings now, 5 years after that first morning. It is June 15th, 1897. The night is warm, and somewhere in the darkness, a fire begins to smolder. No one knows exactly how it started. Perhaps faulty electrical wiring. Perhaps a careless flame. Perhaps something else entirely. The records would later note that the cause remained unknown. By midnight, the wooden walls of Ellis Island were consumed by flame. Close your eyes and see the scene. The orange glow reflecting off the harbor waters. The frantic silhouettes of watchmen and nurses evacuating more than 200 immigrants who had been detained overnight. The sick being carried from hospital beds. The elderly being guided down smoke-filled corridors. And through it all, the roar of flames devouring 5 years of history. Remarkably, no one died. Every immigrant, every patient, every employee escaped into the night. But when dawn broke over the harbor, Ellis Island was nothing but ash and cinder. The beautiful pine buildings had burned to the ground in less than 2 hours. And with them went something irreplaceable. All the immigration records from 1855 had been destroyed. Time moves like honey as we travel through what was lost. Think of it. Every manifest, every registry book, every piece of paper documenting the arrival of approximately 1.5 million immigrants. Gone. The names of those who had passed through Castle Garden, the previous immigration station at the southern tip of Manhattan. The records of the early years at Ellis Island itself, all reduced to smoke and memory. For genealogists and family historians, this loss remains one of the great tragedies of American record-keeping. Countless families searching for their ancestors have reached a wall at 1897, beyond which the official documentation simply does not exist. The customs lists survive, kept safe in a separate office, but they contain far less detail than the immigration records that burned. And yet, something else emerged from those ashes. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. The federal government immediately ordered a new immigration station to be built, but this time with one crucial condition. Every future structure on Ellis Island must be fireproof. Within 3 years, the island would be transformed, The wooden buildings were replaced by magnificent structures of red brick and limestone, designed in the French Renaissance style. The new main building, which still stands today, could process 5,000 immigrants per day. Its registry room, with its soaring, vaulted ceiling, became one of the most photographed spaces in American immigration history. But alongside the grand public halls, other buildings began to rise on the island. Buildings that most visitors would never see. Buildings where the darker chapters of Ellis Island's history would unfold. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the first foundations of the immigrant hospital were being laid. Imagine the sounds of construction drifting across the water, the rhythmic strike of hammers, the calls of workers in a dozen different languages, the slow expansion of the island itself, as landfill from New York's subway excavation was dumped along the shoreline, creating new land where none had existed before. By 1902, Ellis Island had grown to include a second island, connected to the first by a covered walkway. This new addition housed the Immigrant Hospital, a facility that would eventually expand to over 20 buildings and become one of the largest public health hospitals in the United States. On the surface, the hospital represented the best of American medicine. It had operating rooms equipped with the latest surgical instruments. It had laboratories conducting cutting-edge research on infectious diseases. It had wards where sick immigrants could recover before being allowed to enter the country. But there was another side to this hospital, a side that the promotional photographs never showed. Feel the weight of history around you as we step through those hospital doors. The doctors at Ellis Island had a system. Every immigrant who climbed the stairs to the registry room was being watched, evaluated, judged from the very first moment they set foot on the island. Public health service physicians stood at the top of the staircase, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of illness or disability. They watched how people walked. Did anyone limp? Did anyone pause to catch their breath? Did anyone seem confused or disoriented? These doctors had developed what they called the line inspection, a rapid visual assessment that could identify potential medical problems in just 6 seconds per person. If anything seemed wrong, a doctor would reach out with a piece of chalk and mark the immigrant's clothing. A single letter scrawled on the lapel or shoulder, that would change the course of that person's life. Slowly, the scene shifts to the marking system. The chalk marks were a code known only to the doctors and inspectors. The letter H meant suspected heart trouble. L indicated lameness. E was for eyes. G for goiter. K for hernia. PG for pregnancy. SC for scalp conditions. S for senility. And then there was X. The letter X, marked high on the right shoulder, meant suspected mental defect. A circled X meant definite signs of mental disease. These marks were the most feared of all, because they almost always led to deportation. Picture the scene in the registry room. Thousands of people packed into the enormous hall, standing in long lines that wound through a maze of metal railings. The air thick with the sound of crying children, nervous conversations, the shuffle of worn shoes on tile floors. And moving through the crowd, men in uniform, their eyes missing nothing, their chalk ready. Roughly 15 to 20% of all immigrants received a chalk mark of some kind. Those who were marked were immediately pulled from the line and sent to examination rooms for further testing. Some would be cleared after a few hours. Others would be detained for days, weeks, even months. And some would never be allowed to enter America at all. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The doctors believed they could read character and intelligence in the shape of a person's head, the look in their eyes, the way they answered simple questions. This was the era of eugenics, when many scientists believed that mental fitness was hereditary and that certain races were inherently superior to others. These beliefs, now thoroughly discredited, shaped the way immigrants were evaluated at Ellis Island. In 1913, a psychologist named Henry Goddard established an intelligence testing program on the island. Doctors used metal calipers to measure the circumference of immigrants' skulls. They administered puzzles and memory tests designed to identify what they called the feeble-minded. Those who failed these tests could be deported, regardless of their physical health or their family connections in America. The problem, of course, was that many of these immigrants spoke no English. They had just completed an exhausting ocean voyage. They were terrified, disoriented, surrounded by strangers in uniforms, asking questions they could not understand. Under such conditions, anyone might appear confused or slow-witted. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. One former translator at Ellis Island, a young man named Fiorello LaGuardia, who would later become the beloved mayor of New York City, wrote about this in his memoirs. He said that many of the immigrants classified as mental cases were so classified because of ignorance. The ignorance of both the immigrants and the so-called medical experts. Some families were separated forever because of a chalk mark. A mother detained while her husband and children were allowed to enter. A child sent back alone to Europe because of a skin condition that would have healed in a few weeks. Brothers and sisters divided by a single letter scrawled on a coat. And perhaps the answer to why this happened doesn't need to arrive tonight. There was one examination that immigrants dreaded more than any other: the test for trachoma, a highly contagious eye infection that could lead to blindness if left untreated. To check for trachoma, doctors would use their bare fingers or a metal button hook to flip back the immigrant's eyelids and examine the inner surface. The button hook examination was painful and frightening. Immigrants would watch as the person ahead of them in line had their eyelids turned inside out and know that they would be next. Some tried to hide, to slip away, to avoid the line. But there was no escape on Ellis Island. If trachoma was detected, the immigrant faced almost certain deportation. 9 out of every 10 people diagnosed with the disease were sent back to their home countries. For many, this meant returning to the very poverty and persecution they had fled. For some, it meant death. Time moves like honey as we consider what this meant. Imagine a family that had saved for years to afford passage to America. Imagine their children who had been told stories of golden streets. And then imagine a doctor with a button hook and a diagnosis that meant the dream was over. This happened thousands of times. And yet, the doctors were not monsters. Many of them genuinely believed they were protecting the American public from disease. The germ theory of medicine was still relatively new, and antibiotics had not yet been invented. A contagious illness could spread rapidly through the crowded tenements where most immigrants lived. The doctors saw themselves as guardians at the gate. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. But there is a difference between guarding a gate and building a wall. And as the years passed, the regulations at Ellis Island grew stricter and stricter. New laws added new categories of excluded persons. Epileptics, those who had experienced 2 bouts of insanity. Anarchists, professional beggars, those with tuberculosis, those deemed likely to become a public charge. The definition of who could enter America was being narrowed, one law at a time. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the island continued to grow. By 1907, Ellis Island had entered its busiest year. Over 1 million immigrants were processed that year alone. On a single day in April, more than 11,000 people passed through the registry room, setting a record that would never be broken. The island's staff worked from dawn until late evening, 7 days a week, processing an average of 5,000 people every day. And on the south side of the island, the hospital complex was expanding to meet the demand. New wards were built for measles patients, for those with scarlet fever, for those with diphtheria. A separate island, Island 3, was created to house the contagious disease hospital, separated from the main island by a ferry basin. The theory at the time was that germs could not cross water, so the physical separation would prevent the spread of illness. Close your eyes and see the hospital as it was in those years. Long corridors connecting building after building. Wards painted in institutional white, their windows looking out over the harbor. The smell of carbolic soap and iodine. The sound of coughing from behind closed doors. Nurses in starched white uniforms moving from bed to bed. Doctors making their rounds with clipboards and stethoscopes. And somewhere, in a small building with a flat roof, the Psychopathic Ward. But that story will wait for another part of our journey. For now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that Ellis Island was a place of contradictions, a gateway and a barrier, a symbol of hope and a site of heartbreak, a place where 12 million dreams came true and where hundreds of thousands of other dreams quietly died. Feel the weight of history around you as we prepare to continue. The fog has thickened over the harbor now, and the lights of Manhattan seem very far away. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn sounds its low, mournful note. The island sleeps, but its secrets remain awake, waiting to be remembered. And as we pause here, let yourself drift with the gentle rhythm of the tides. The story will be waiting when you return. There is no rush, no urgency, no mystery that demands solving tonight. Only the soft persistence of memory and the quiet turning of forgotten pages. And perhaps, in that stillness, you can almost hear them. The voices of all those who passed through this place, the hopeful and the afraid, the welcomed and the rejected, the ones who built new lives and the ones who never got the chance. They are all here, in the salt air and the weathered brick, in the creaking of old floorboards and the whisper of names long forgotten. And their stories are just beginning. As you settle deeper into this moment, consider how many footsteps have worn these floors, how many hands have gripped the same railings, how many eyes have looked up at the same vaulted ceiling, searching for some sign of what their future might hold. The immigrants who came to Ellis Island carried more than just their luggage. They carried recipes that would become American classics. They carried songs that would blend with other traditions to create new forms of music. They carried stories and superstitions, prayers and hopes, the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent in villages and cities across Europe and beyond. Picture yourself walking through the baggage room on the first floor of the main building. Mountains of trunks and bundles and tied-up parcels. Wicker baskets containing everything a family owned. feather beds rolled and bound with rope, brass samovars polished to a shine, prayer books in Hebrew and Italian and Polish and Greek, photographs of people who would never be seen again. Every object tells a story. Every possession represents a choice. What do you bring when you can only carry what fits in your arms? What do you leave behind forever? And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Some immigrants arrived with almost nothing. A change of clothes, a few coins, the name and address of a relative written on a scrap of paper. Others brought treasures that had been in their families for generations. In the gentle flow of time, these objects became artifacts, evidence of lives that were lived, of journeys that were taken, of courage that cannot be measured. The inspectors at Ellis Island were required to ask each immigrant the same 29 questions: name, age, marital status, occupation, final destination, the amount of money they carried, whether they could read and write. Most immigrants passed through in a matter of hours. They answered the questions and were released to begin their new lives. But for some, the questions led to more questions. The board was made up of 3 inspectors who sat behind a long table in a small room. There was no lawyer present because immigrants did not have a legal right to enter the United States. The government could exclude anyone for almost any reason. Imagine sitting in that room, exhausted from the voyage, unable to speak English. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The board reviewed approximately 70,000 cases each year. 5 out of every 6 detainees were eventually admitted, but for the 6th, the journey ended here. But they stayed. They persevered. They built lives and raised families, and slowly, generation by generation, became American. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Tonight, as the harbor lights dim and the ferries cease their journeys, Ellis Island rests in the embrace of the tides. The brick towers stand sentinel over the water, just as they have for more than a century. The registry room is empty now, but the echoes remain. And somewhere in the soft darkness, the next chapter of our story waits. A chapter that will take us deeper into the forgotten corners of this island, into the hospital wards where hope and despair lived side by side, into the rooms where families were separated, sometimes forever. But for now, let yourself rest. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you toward sleep, and the island will keep its secrets a little while longer. The hospital waited in the fog. On the south side of Ellis Island, separated from the main buildings by a narrow strip of water, there stood a complex of brick structures that most visitors never saw. These were the wards where hope went to wait, and sometimes to die. And tonight, as the harbor settles into stillness, we will walk through their forgotten corridors together. Picture yourself drifting back now to the year 1911. The Contagious Disease Hospital has just opened its doors for the first time. It sprawls across a third island, created entirely from landfill, connected to the rest of Ellis Island by covered walkways that stretch across the water like long, pale fingers. Feel the weight of history around you as we step inside. The medical staff believed that germs could not travel across open water. This was the theory that shaped the hospital's design. Each ward was built as a separate pavilion, isolated from the others, with tall windows that let in the salt air from the harbor. The doctors hoped that the breeze would carry illness away, out over the waves, away from the city that glittered on the horizon. In a way,
The hospital was a marvel of its time. It had 8 measles wards, 3 isolation pavilions, operating rooms equipped with the latest instruments, and a laboratory where researchers studied diseases that had no cure. Over 10,000 patients from 75 different countries would be treated here in a single year. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed.
But beneath the progressive medicine and the gleaming equipment, there were darker rooms. Rooms where the walls were reinforced and the doors locked from the outside. Rooms where the windows looked out through iron bars at a view of Lady Liberty that felt impossibly far away. The Psychopathic Ward stood apart from the other buildings, a 2-story brick structure with a flat roof that made it distinct from everything around it. It was designed to house 20 to 30 patients at a time, immigrants who had been marked with that dreaded letter X during the line inspection. Slowly, the scene shifts to what happened inside those walls. The doctors who worked in the Psychopathic Ward believed they were doing important work. They were tasked with identifying mental illness, with protecting American society from those they considered unfit. But the definition of mental illness in 1911 was very different from what we understand today. The immigration laws of that era listed the categories of people who must be excluded from the United States. Among them were idiots, imbeciles, the feeble-minded, epileptics, and the insane. These were the official terms written into law that doctors used to label human beings. Time moves like honey as we consider what this meant. Imagine an immigrant who had just completed a harrowing 2-week journey across the Atlantic. Perhaps they had fled a pogrom in Russia, watching their village burn before they escaped. Perhaps they had left behind everything and everyone they loved. Perhaps they had not slept properly in weeks, had barely eaten, had spent the voyage seasick in the darkness below deck. Now imagine that person being asked questions in a language they do not understand, in a room full of uniformed strangers, with their entire future hanging on every answer. Would it be surprising if they seemed confused, disoriented, slow to respond? And yet, such behavior could earn an X marked on their coat, and once marked, they would find themselves in the Psychopathic Ward, waiting to learn their fate. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. One woman named Leah Shane, who immigrated as a child, later told oral historians about her Aunt Pearl. Pearl had been detained at Ellis Island because officials believed she was mentally ill. The family insisted she was not. But Pearl was deported back to Europe anyway. Years later, Pearl died in the Holocaust. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Fiorello LaGuardia, who worked as an interpreter at Ellis Island before becoming the mayor of New York City, wrote about cases like Pearl's. He said that many immigrants classified as mental cases were so classified because of ignorance. He meant the ignorance of the medical staff, who often could not communicate effectively with the people they were evaluating. There were supposed to be interpreters assigned to the Psychopathic Ward. The regulations required it. But the reality was different. The interpreters were often spread too thin, dealing with the thousands of immigrants who arrived every day. Sometimes there was no one available who spoke a particular dialect. Sometimes the examination proceeded anyway, with doctors trying to assess a person's mental state through gestures and guesswork. Close your eyes and see the ward as it was. Small rooms with iron-framed beds. A day room where patients could sit during the day, looking out through barred windows at the harbor. A veranda that was open to the air in summer, closed off in winter. Nurses in white uniforms. Doctors with clipboards, making notes, making decisions. The Psychopathic Ward was not a place for treatment. It was a place for observation and judgment. Immigrants were held there until a determination could be made about whether they would be allowed to enter the country or sent back to where they came from. Some waited for days, others for weeks, a few for months. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. There was no cure for what the doctors called feeble-mindedness, no treatment for what they labeled imbecility. These were considered permanent conditions, hereditary defects that could not be corrected. The only solution, in the eyes of the law, was exclusion. The influence of eugenics was everywhere in these decisions. In 1913, a psychologist named Henry Goddard established an intelligence testing program at Ellis Island. He believed that mental ability was hereditary and that certain races were naturally more intelligent than others. His tests were designed to identify those he considered unfit. Slowly, the scene shifts to how these tests were administered. Doctors would show immigrants a series of puzzles and ask them to complete them within a certain time. They would ask simple questions about arithmetic, about geography, about common objects. They would use metal calipers to measure the circumference of an immigrant's skull, believing that head size was related to intelligence. The problems with these tests are obvious now. Many immigrants had never been to school. They could not read or write in any language. They had no experience with the kind of abstract puzzles the doctors used. And they were being tested in a state of exhaustion and fear in an unfamiliar environment by people who did not speak their language. Picture yourself walking through the testing room, a long table covered with wooden blocks and metal puzzles. Doctors in white coats, stopwatches in hand. Immigrants sitting nervously, trying to understand what was being asked of them. The scratch of pencils recording the results. Pass or fail. Admit or deport. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the hospital wards continued their daily routines. In the measles pavilions, children lay in rows of white beds, their families unable to visit. Measles was highly contagious, and the doctors feared an outbreak that could spread to the city. So the sick were isolated, cared for by nurses and doctors, but separated from everyone they loved. Feel the weight of history around you. During the decades the hospital operated, approximately 3,500 immigrants died on Ellis Island. More than half of them were children. They died of measles and scarlet fever, of tuberculosis and diphtheria, of whooping cough and pneumonia. They died far from home, in rooms that looked out over a harbor they had crossed with such hope. And 350 babies were born here too, born on American soil, yet not automatically American citizens. Their citizenship depended on the fate of their parents, on whether the family would be admitted or deported. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. There was a maternity ward in the hospital, where pregnant women who had been detained could give birth. The doctors and nurses who worked there delivered babies in the shadow of Lady Liberty, in a place that was supposed to be a gateway to freedom, but was, for some, a prison. One of the most poignant aspects of the hospital was its morgue, a small building on Island 3, equipped with an autopsy room and a refrigerated space that could hold 8 bodies. When immigrants died at Ellis Island, their bodies were examined here, the cause of death recorded, the mystery of their passing documented for the records. Those who could afford it were buried by their families. Those who could not were buried in potter's fields, in unmarked graves that held the unclaimed dead of New York City.
Some of these immigrants had traveled thousands of miles, survived incredible hardships, come within sight of their dreams, only to be buried in graves that no one would ever visit. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away.
There were also suicides. The records mention 3 during the island's operation, but there may have been more that were not officially recorded. Some immigrants, facing deportation after having come so far, chose death over return. They threw themselves into the harbor or found other ways to end their suffering. The hospital staff did what they could to prevent such tragedies. The windows were barred. The wards were watched. But despair cannot always be contained by architecture. And perhaps the answer to why this happened doesn't need to arrive tonight. Despite all this darkness, the Ellis Island Hospital also represented something remarkable. It was one of the most advanced medical facilities in the country, staffed by doctors who genuinely cared about their patients. 9 out of 10 people who were treated there recovered and were eventually allowed to enter the United States. The mortality rate was remarkably low, given the severity of the diseases being treated and the limited medical knowledge of the time. No major epidemic was ever traced to an immigrant who passed through Ellis Island. The doctors and nurses who worked there succeeded in their primary mission, which was to protect American public health. Time moves like honey as we hold these contradictions together. The hospital was both a place of healing and a place of heartbreak. It saved lives and destroyed dreams. It represented the best of American medicine and the worst of American prejudice. It was, in many ways, a mirror of the country itself, reflecting all the beauty and all the ugliness of a nation built by immigrants, yet often hostile to immigration. Picture yourself standing on the shore of Island 3 as the sun sets over Manhattan. The wards are quieting now. The patients are settling into their beds for another night of waiting. The nurses are making their final rounds, checking temperatures, adjusting blankets, offering whatever comfort they can. And across the water, the lights of the city begin to flicker on, one by one, like stars coming out in an earthbound sky. Somewhere in those streets, families are gathering for dinner. Children are doing homework. Workers are coming home after long days in factories and shops. For the immigrants watching from the hospital windows, that city represents everything they came for. And yet it remains just out of reach, separated by a narrow strip of water that might as well be an ocean. Close your eyes and see them there, faces pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on the distant skyline, hands clasping the bars that frame the view, waiting for a verdict that will determine the rest of their lives. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will continue when you return. There are more corridors to walk, more secrets to uncover, more voices waiting to be heard. But for now, let yourself rest in the quiet of this moment. The harbor is dark. The ferries have stopped running. The island sleeps beneath a blanket of fog and memory. And somewhere in that silence, a door remains slightly open, waiting for the next part of our journey to begin. As you settle deeper into this moment, consider the tuberculosis ward. It was different from all the others. The patients there were not grouped together in open wards. Instead, they had single beds in private rooms. The doors to these rooms were locked from the outside. There was no cure for tuberculosis in 1911. The patient either survived or died, and the doctors could do little to influence which outcome would occur. The best they could offer was rest, fresh air, and isolation from others who might catch the disease. Picture yourself walking past those locked doors. Through the small windows, you might catch glimpses of the patients inside. Men and women, young and old, from countries all across Europe and beyond. Some lying still, conserving their strength. Others sitting up in bed, staring out at the harbor. A few reading letters that had traveled across the ocean to find them here. The tuberculosis ward looked out toward the open sea. The doctors believed that the salt air had healing properties, that the breeze from the harbor could somehow cleanse the lungs of disease. So the windows were kept open whenever weather permitted, and the patients breathed in the same air that carried the smell of the city they might never reach. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Some of them did recover. After weeks or months of rest, their symptoms would fade, their strength would return, and they would be released to begin their American lives. But others were not so fortunate. The records show that tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death at the Ellis Island Hospital. It was a slow killer, patient and relentless. Immigrants who had survived the voyage, who had come so close to their dreams, found themselves trapped in those locked rooms, watching their lives slip away. For the families of these patients, the situation was agonizing. They had often already entered the United States, settled in apartments in the city, found jobs, begun building their new lives. And then a telegram would arrive, informing them that a husband or wife, a son or daughter, a parent or sibling, had been detained on Ellis Island with tuberculosis. Some families visited as often as they were allowed, making the ferry journey to the island to sit with their loved ones through the barred windows. Others could not afford the time away from work, could not risk losing the jobs that paid their rent. They had to choose between visiting the sick and surviving themselves. Slowly, the scene shifts to another kind of waiting. There was a category of detainees that the officials called likely to become a public charge. These were immigrants who, for various reasons, the inspectors believed would not be able to support themselves in America. They might be too old, too sick, or too disabled to work. They might have arrived without enough money. They might have no relatives in the country to take them in. Women traveling alone were automatically scrutinized more closely than men. A woman without a husband or father to meet her at the dock might be detained until someone came to claim her. Pregnant women who had no husband were treated with particular suspicion. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Unescorted women and children were not allowed to leave Ellis Island by themselves. They had to wait until a telegram arrived from a relative, or until someone physically came to the island to collect them. This was supposed to protect them from exploitation, from the pimps and labor agents who preyed on vulnerable newcomers. But it also meant that women who had traveled all the way from Europe by themselves, demonstrating remarkable independence and courage, were suddenly treated as if they could not take a single step without male supervision. Some of these women waited for days in the detention dormitories. They slept in bunk beds stacked 3 high, ate meals in the crowded dining hall, and watched the ferries leave for Manhattan without them. Every day, they hoped that today would be the day someone came to release them. Picture yourself in the women's dormitory. The room is long and narrow, filled with rows of metal beds. The mattresses are thin, covered with wool blankets that smell of disinfectant. At one end, a window looks out over the harbor. At the other, a door leads to the corridor where matrons patrol at regular intervals. The women here come from everywhere: Russia and Poland, Italy and Greece, Ireland and Germany and Austria-Hungary. They speak in a babble of languages, sharing food from their parcels, trading stories of where they came from, and where they hope to go. Some have been here for days, a few for weeks, and all of them are waiting. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. The dormitories could be surprisingly lively places. In the evenings, immigrants would gather to play music, to dance, to share the songs of their homelands. The guards generally allowed this, understanding that people who had been through so much needed some form of release. But there was always an undercurrent of anxiety. Every day, names were called over the loudspeaker, and some of those names meant admission, while others meant rejection. The immigrants learned to read the faces of the officials, trying to divine their fates from the smallest expressions. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the Board of Special Inquiry continued its work. The hearings took place in small rooms on the main island. 3 inspectors sat behind a table, reviewing the case of each detained immigrant. There were no lawyers allowed, no formal rules of evidence, no right to appeal. The board could admit or exclude anyone based on whatever reasoning seemed appropriate. Most hearings lasted only a few minutes. The inspector would read from the immigrant's file, ask a few questions through an interpreter, and then render a verdict. 5 out of 6 detainees were eventually admitted, but for the 6th, the journey was over. Close your eyes and see the moment of rejection. The interpreter explains, gently, that the government has decided you cannot stay. You will be taken back to your ship and return to the port where your voyage began. Your passage was paid for a round trip, as required by law, so at least you will not have to find money for the return. But everything else is gone. The savings you spent on the journey, the job that was waiting for you, the family members you came to join, the future you had imagined in your most hopeful dreams. Time moves like honey as we consider what came next. Deportees were held in separate detention areas from those still waiting for decisions. The guards were careful to keep them apart, to prevent the despair of the rejected from spreading to those who still had hope. Some deportees went quietly, resigned to their fate. Others fought, arguing their cases through every channel available, writing letters, seeking help from immigrant aid societies, clinging to any possibility that the decision might be reversed. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The immigrant aid societies were a crucial part of life on Ellis Island. Organizations representing different religious and ethnic groups maintained offices on the island, providing assistance to their communities. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society helped Jewish immigrants. The Italian Welfare League helped Italians. Catholic and Protestant charities helped their respective flocks. These organizations could provide translators, could help immigrants communicate with relatives in the city, could sometimes even provide the money or guarantees that would satisfy the inspectors. They were a lifeline for those who had no other support, but they could not help everyone. The laws were clear about who must be excluded, and no amount of charity could change a diagnosis of tuberculosis or a determination of feeble-mindedness. Feel the weight of history around you. By 1907, the hospital complex covered most of the south side of Ellis Island. There were wards for measles, wards for scarlet fever, wards for diphtheria, wards for whooping cough. There was a psychiatric pavilion where those suspected of mental illness were observed. There was a maternity ward where babies were born into uncertainty. And there were the quiet rooms where the dying spent their final hours, looking out at a city they would never reach. The fog is thickening now over the harbor. The lights of Manhattan are just a soft glow through the mist.
and the hospital settles into another night of waiting, of hoping, of dreaming and fearing.
Our story will continue. There are more chapters to come, more voices to hear, more secrets to uncover. But for now, let yourself drift towards sleep. The island will be here when you return. The stairs told the first story. Every immigrant who entered the main building at Ellis Island had to climb a long flight of steps to reach the registry room on the second floor. What most of them did not know was that doctors were watching them from the top, observing every footstep, every stumble, every pause to catch their breath. Picture yourself at the bottom of those stairs now, looking up. The steps are wide and worn, marked by the passage of millions of feet. Above, the doorway opens into a vast hall filled with the murmur of voices and the shuffle of waiting crowds. And standing just inside that doorway, almost invisible against the wall, two physicians in uniform watch you begin your climb. Feel the weight of history around you. The doctors called this the line inspection, and it began the moment an immigrant stepped off the ferry. Every movement was being evaluated. A limp could indicate lameness. Shortness of breath could suggest heart disease. Confusion could mean mental deficiency. The doctors had trained themselves to spot these signs in seconds, making judgments that would determine the course of human lives. By the time an immigrant reached the top of the stairs, the first assessment was already complete. Those who had aroused suspicion would find themselves pulled aside for further examination. Those who had climbed without incident would continue into the great hall, not knowing how close they had come to a very different fate. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The registry room was the largest space most immigrants had ever seen. Its vaulted ceiling rose 48 feet above the tile floor, supported by massive arched windows that let in the gray light of the harbor. The room was divided by a maze of iron railings that channeled the crowds into separate lines, each one leading to an inspector's desk at the far end. In 1907, this room processed over 11,000 people in a single day. That record, set on April 17th of that year, has never been broken. The inspectors worked from 9 in the morning until 7 at night, 7 days a week, asking the same questions over and over again. Name, age, occupation, destination. How much money do you carry? Can you read? Slowly, the scene shifts to what these questions really meant. The immigration laws required that newcomers prove they would not become a burden on American society. An immigrant needed to show that they had a place to go, a relative to receive them, or enough money to support themselves while they found work. The exact amount varied over the years, but generally the inspectors wanted to see at least $18 to $25 in cash. This was a significant sum. For many immigrants, it represented months of savings. Some families pooled their resources, sending one member ahead with the family's entire fortune, trusting that person to send for the others once they had established themselves. And some immigrants had a trick. They would borrow money from other passengers just before disembarking, show it to the inspectors, and then return it once they had passed through. The authorities knew about this practice, but it was difficult to prevent. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. The inspectors were not heartless. Many of them were immigrants themselves, or the children of immigrants. They understood what the people in front of them had been through, what they hoped to find in America. Most inspectors tried to give everyone a fair chance. But the law was the law. Certain categories of people had to be excluded, no matter how sympathetic their circumstances. And the pressure to process thousands of people every day meant that decisions had to be made quickly, sometimes too quickly.
Picture yourself standing in line in the registry room. The hours pass slowly. You shuffle forward a few feet at a time, your belongings heavy in your arms. Around you, hundreds of other people are doing the same thing, speaking in languages you may or may not understand. Children are crying. Adults are whispering prayers in a dozen different tongues.
And then, finally, you reach the front of the line. The inspector looks up from his desk. Through an interpreter, he begins to ask his questions. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. For most immigrants, this moment of inspection lasted only 2 or 3 minutes. The inspector would verify your answers against the ship's manifest, stamp your papers, and wave you through. You would collect your belongings, exchange some money at the currency booth, and walk down to the ferry that would carry you to Manhattan. But for some, the questions led to problems. A discrepancy in the records, an answer that did not match what had been written at the port of departure, a piece of information that raised suspicions. These immigrants would be marked for special inquiry, their papers stamped with the letters SI, their hopes put on hold. Time moves like honey as we consider what the special inquiry meant. The Board of Special Inquiry met in small rooms off the main hall. 3 inspectors, seated behind a table, would review each case individually. The immigrant would stand before them, often with an interpreter, and try to explain whatever problem had brought them to this point. Perhaps they had given the wrong occupation, confused by the question or by the translation. Perhaps they had arrived with less money than the rules required. Perhaps a family member who was supposed to meet them had not yet arrived. Perhaps there was simply something about their appearance or manner that had troubled an inspector. The board had broad discretion to admit or exclude. There were no lawyers, no formal rules of evidence, no jury. The decision was final, subject only to appeal to officials in Washington, who rarely overturned the judgment of the men on the ground. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. About 70,000 cases went before the Board of Special Inquiry each year during the peak period of immigration. 5 out of 6 were eventually admitted, but that 6th person, roughly 12,000 people each year, received the devastating news that they could not stay. Some of them had family already in America, children who had traveled ahead, parents who had sent for them, spouses who had been building a life in the new country, waiting for the day when the whole family would be reunited. For these families, an adverse decision from the board meant a terrible choice. Would the relatives in America return to Europe with the rejected immigrant? Would they stay in America and hope that somehow, someday, the situation would change? Would they say goodbye forever? Close your eyes and see the moment of parting. A husband and wife standing on opposite sides of a metal railing. Children crying, not understanding why they cannot go with their father. A translator trying to explain, gently, that there is nothing more to be done. Guards waiting to escort the deportee to the ferry that will return them to their ship. These scenes played out at Ellis Island day after day, year after year. The guards called the parting area the kissing post because it was where families embraced for what might be the last time. Slowly, the scene shifts to those who were left behind. After the deportees were taken away, the remaining family members would be released into America. They would board the ferry to Manhattan, find their way to the tenements of the Lower East Side or the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, and begin their new lives with a hole in their hearts that nothing could fill. The records suggest that many of these separated families eventually reunited. Some deportees tried again months or years later, entering through a different port, or after the condition that had caused their exclusion had been resolved. Some were able to send for the relatives they had left behind in Europe, but others were never reunited. The ocean was wide, and the world was dangerous. Wars and pogroms swept through Europe. Economic depressions made travel impossible. And for some families, the separation that began on Ellis Island became permanent. Feel the weight of history around you. There were attempts to make the experience less traumatic. Charitable organizations maintained representatives on the island who could help immigrants communicate with relatives, who could provide translators for board hearings, who could sometimes even provide the money or guarantees that would satisfy the inspectors. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was particularly active, helping Jewish immigrants who faced persecution if they were returned to Russia or Eastern Europe. Catholic charities helped immigrants from Italy and Ireland. Protestant organizations helped those from Northern Europe. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. These organizations saved countless people from deportation. They found relatives who had been unable to meet their families at the dock. They raised money to satisfy the financial requirements. They provided documentation that clarified confusing situations. But they could not help everyone. Some cases were simply hopeless. A diagnosis of tuberculosis could not be argued away. A finding of mental deficiency could not be overturned by charity. Certain categories of exclusion were absolute. Picture yourself in the offices of the Immigrant Aid Societies, small rooms crowded with desks and filing cabinets. Social workers and volunteers speaking in the languages of a dozen countries. Immigrants sitting nervously, waiting to learn if there was any hope. Telegraph machines clicking with messages to and from relatives in the city. The air is thick with anxiety and hope, with the smell of old paper and the sound of whispered prayers. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. There were happier scenes, too. Families reunited after years apart. Children meeting grandparents they had never known. Couples married in the small chapel on the island, their ceremony witnessed by strangers who had become friends during the long wait. The dining hall served 3 meals a day to the detained immigrants. The food was not elegant, but it was plentiful and nutritious. Many immigrants ate better on Ellis Island than they had in weeks, their bellies full of beef stew and bread and pie. There were recreation areas where children could play. There was a library with books in several languages. There were nurses who checked on the sick and doctors who treated minor ailments. The staff, for the most part, tried to make the experience as bearable as possible. Time moves like honey as we hold these different experiences together. Ellis Island was a place of extremes, joy and despair, hope and heartbreak, new beginnings and final endings. It contained all of these at once, in the same buildings, in the same hours, sometimes in the same families. A mother might be admitted while her child was held for medical observation. A husband might pass through while his wife was detained for questions about her character. A family might arrive together, but leave in different directions, some to the city and some back to the ship. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And through it all, the island itself grew. Landfill was constantly being added, extending the shoreline, creating new space for new buildings. What had started as a 3-acre sandbar eventually expanded to over 27 acres, growing to meet the needs of the millions who passed through. By 1924, the peak immigration era was coming to an end. New laws drastically reduced the number of immigrants who would be admitted to the United States. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 established strict quotas based on national origin, deliberately designed to reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Close your eyes and see the island as the crowds begin to thin. The registry room, once packed with thousands, now holds only hundreds. The lines move quickly, the inspectors less harried. The dormitories have empty beds. The hospital wards have empty rooms, and somewhere in the silence that settles over the island, a different kind of story begins to unfold. The era of mass immigration was ending. But Ellis Island would find new purposes, new populations, new secrets to keep. And those stories, too, are waiting to be told. For now, let yourself rest in the quiet of this moment. The harbor is dark, the city lights distant, the island settling into sleep. And the next chapter of our journey waits just beyond the horizon. As you settle deeper into this moment, consider what came after the great immigration waves ended. The Immigration Act of 1924 changed everything. It established quotas based on national origin, using the census of 1890 as a baseline. This was deliberate. By 1890, the majority of immigrants still came from Northern and Western Europe. Using that year as the standard meant that future immigration would favor those countries over the Southern and Eastern European nations that had dominated immigration in the early 20th century. Picture yourself on Ellis Island in 1925. The Great Hall is quiet now. Where once 5,000 people might pass through in a single day, now there are only a few hundred. The immigration officials have time to sit and talk with each newcomer. The lines move quickly. The chaos of the earlier years has given way to an almost eerie calm. But the island is not empty. It has found new purposes, darker purposes, that reflect the changing mood of the nation. Feel the weight of history around you. In the 1920s, Ellis Island became primarily a detention and deportation center. The immigrants who arrived now were mostly those with problems in their paperwork, those who had issues with their health, or those who had been identified as politically dangerous. The era of the Red Scare had begun. The Russian Revolution had sent shock waves through the world, and American authorities were deeply fearful of communism and anarchism. Labor strikes, occasional violence, and political radicalism convinced many that dangerous foreign ideologies were threatening the nation. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. In 1919, the Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island, a man named Frederick Howe, wrote in despair that he had become a jailer. The island that had once been a gateway to America was now a prison for those deemed politically suspect. The Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, began rounding up immigrants across the country who were believed to be communists or anarchists. These people were shipped to Ellis Island to await deportation. They arrived on what became known as the deportation trains, packed into rail cars like cargo. Some of them were genuinely dangerous, but many were simply people who had attended the wrong meetings, read the wrong newspapers, or expressed opinions that frightened their neighbors. In the panic of the Red Scare, the distinction between actual threats and mere political dissent was often lost. Slowly, the scene shifts to the detention cells. The original buildings had been designed for immigrants passing through, not for long-term detention. But now the dormitories were converted to holding areas. Barred windows replaced open ones. Guards patrolled the corridors. The island took on the character of a prison. Some of the detainees were held for months while their cases were processed. They had few rights, limited access to lawyers, and no certainty about what would happen to them. Many were eventually deported to countries where they faced persecution or death. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. One of the most famous deportees was Emma Goldman, the anarchist activist who had lived in America for 30 years. In 1919, she was stripped of her citizenship and expelled from the country, sent back to Russia on a ship that carried 249 other deportees. She would never return. There were also quieter deportations of people whose names history has forgotten. Workers who had tried to organize unions, writers who had published radical newspapers, ordinary people who had attended political meetings out of curiosity rather than conviction. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. The detention facilities on Ellis Island expanded during this period. New buildings were constructed, designed specifically for holding people rather than processing them. The island that had welcomed millions was being transformed into something very different. And yet, even during these dark years, immigration continued. The quotas allowed some people through, and Ellis Island still processed legitimate arrivals alongside the detainees and deportees. Families still reunited. Dreams still came true. But the scale was vastly reduced. Picture yourself walking through the island in the late 1920s. The main building still stands, its brick towers rising above the harbor. But many of the secondary buildings have been converted to other uses. The hospital continues to operate, though with fewer patients. The ferries still run, but they carry more guards than immigrants. And somewhere in the abandoned corners of the island, the first signs of decay are beginning to appear. Time moves like honey as we move through the following decades. The Great Depression struck in 1929, and immigration plummeted even further. Few people could afford to travel, and fewer still wanted to come to a country mired in economic collapse. Ellis Island became almost entirely a detention facility, processing deportees and a trickle of new arrivals. The hospital closed in 1930, its wards no longer needed for the thousands who had once filled them. The buildings began to deteriorate without maintenance. Paint peeled from the walls. Windows cracked and were not replaced. The salt air from the harbor slowly ate away at everything the builders had created. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. World War II brought new activity to the island. Enemy aliens, primarily German and Italian nationals, were detained there during the war. The facilities that had once held immigrants fleeing persecution now held people suspected of loyalty to foreign powers. Some of these detainees were genuinely dangerous. Others were simply caught up in the paranoia of wartime. The government could not always tell the difference, and in the interest of security, many innocent people spent months or years confined on Ellis Island. Close your eyes and see the island during the war years. Barbed wire surrounds some of the buildings. Guards patrol with rifles. The sounds of the harbor are punctuated by the drone of aircraft overhead, by the distant rumble of ships carrying troops to Europe. And in the dormitories, men wait. Germans who had lived in America for decades suddenly classified as enemy aliens. Italians who had raised families and built businesses now confined behind barred windows. Japanese Americans transported from the West Coast caught in the same web of suspicion. Feel the weight of history around you. After the war, Ellis Island's role changed again. The Internal Security Act of 1950 barred members of communist organizations from entering the United States. The Cold War had begun, and the fear of communist infiltration replaced the fear of fascist aggression. The detention population swelled again. People suspected of communist sympathies were held on Ellis Island while their cases were reviewed. The hearings were often brief, the evidence often thin, the outcomes often predetermined. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. By the early 1950s, the end was near. The buildings were crumbling. The ferries were old and unreliable. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. There was talk of closing the island entirely. On November 12, 1954, the last detainee was released from Ellis Island. A Norwegian seaman named Arne Petersen became the final person to be processed there, just as Annie Moore had been the first, 62 years earlier. And then the island fell silent. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. For 10 years, Ellis Island stood abandoned. Vandals broke in and stripped anything of value. Copper pipes were torn from the walls. Doorknobs and light fixtures disappeared. Documents were scattered across the floors, left to rot in the damp air. Nature began to reclaim what humans had built. Weeds pushed through cracks in the floors. Trees sprouted in the courtyards. Birds nested in the rafters of the Great Hall, where millions had once waited to learn their fates. Picture yourself on the island during those abandoned years. The silence is almost complete. The only sounds are the lapping of waves against the seawall, the cry of gulls overhead, the rustle of wind through broken windows. The buildings stand like monuments to a forgotten age, their grandeur slowly crumbling into dust. And somewhere in that silence, the ghosts of 12 million dreams keep their quiet vigil. The fog settles over the harbor. The lights of the city seem impossibly distant. And the island waits for something, for someone, for a future that has not yet arrived. Our story is almost done, but there is one more chapter to tell. One more night to spend in the company of these forgotten walls. For now, let yourself drift toward sleep. The story will be waiting when you return. The island remembered, even when no one else did. For more than a decade after its closure in 1954, Ellis Island stood abandoned in the harbor, a ghost of its former self. The great halls that had once echoed with the voices of millions now held only silence and decay. And yet, in that silence, the stories remained, waiting to be rediscovered. Picture yourself drifting through those empty corridors now. The paint is peeling from the walls in long, curling strips. Plaster has fallen from the ceilings, leaving exposed brick and rusting metal. Glass crunches underfoot where windows have shattered. And everywhere the smell of salt and decay, of history slowly returning to the earth. Feel the weight of history around you. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed a proclamation making Ellis Island part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. The island was now protected by the National Park Service, but that protection was mostly theoretical. There was no money for restoration, no staff to maintain the buildings, no visitors to walk the halls. The island continued to crumble, and if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Through the broken windows, you could see Manhattan in the distance, unchanged and unchanging. The city had grown up around the harbor, spreading skyward in towers of glass and steel. But Ellis Island remained frozen in time, a relic of an era that most Americans had forgotten. It was not until 1976 that the island opened to the public for the first time since its closure. Visitors could take ferries across the harbor and walk through the ruins, stepping carefully over debris, imagining what the place had been like when it was alive with hope and fear. Slowly, the scene shifts to what those early visitors saw. The registry room was still recognizable, its vaulted ceiling still intact, its arched windows still letting in the gray harbor light. But the floor was covered with rubble, and the walls were blackened with decades of neglect. The inspection desks where millions had been processed had long since been removed or destroyed. The hospital buildings were in even worse condition. Roofs had collapsed, walls had buckled. The wards where immigrants had recovered from illness or waited to be deported were now open to the sky, their beds and equipment scattered like bones. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Some visitors found the decay profoundly moving. In the peeling paint and the broken glass, they saw a metaphor for the immigrant experience itself, for the way that dreams can be worn down by time and circumstance. Others simply found it sad, a reminder of how quickly the present becomes the past. The movement to restore Ellis Island began slowly. Historic preservation groups raised awareness of the island's significance. Politicians argued that it should be saved as a monument to American immigration. Fundraising campaigns appealed to the descendants of those who had passed through. Time moves like honey as we move toward restoration. In 1982, a private foundation was established to raise money for the restoration. Lee Iacocca, the chairman of Chrysler Corporation, led the effort, bringing corporate support and public attention to the cause. Over the next several years, more than $150 million was raised. The restoration of the main building began in 1984 and was completed in 1990. Workers carefully removed decades of accumulated damage, restoring the registry room to something approaching its original grandeur. New exhibits were created, telling the stories of those who had passed through. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. On September 10, 1990, the Ellis Island Immigration Museum opened to the public. For the first time in nearly 40 years, visitors could walk through the Great Hall, could stand where their ancestors had stood, could imagine what it must have been like to climb those stairs and face the inspectors who would decide their fate. The museum quickly became one of the most visited sites in the country. Every year, millions of people made the ferry journey across the harbor, seeking connection to their family histories, seeking understanding of what it meant to be American. Picture yourself in the restored registry room. The ceiling gleams with fresh paint. The arched windows sparkle in the morning light. The wooden benches have been replaced, the inspection desks recreated from historical photographs. And along the walls, exhibits tell the stories of those who passed through, their voices preserved in recorded testimonies, their faces captured in century-old photographs. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. But not everything was restored. The hospital complex on the south side of the island remained in ruins, too expensive to rehabilitate, too significant to tear down. These buildings stood as silent witnesses to the darker chapters of Ellis Island's history, their crumbling walls still holding the ghosts of those who suffered and died there. In 1998, a non-profit organization called Save Ellis Island began the long process of stabilizing the hospital buildings. They could not afford a full restoration, but they could prevent further decay, could preserve what remained for future generations. Close your eyes and see the hospital as it exists today. Paint continues to peel from the walls, but the roofs have been repaired. Windows that were broken have been covered to keep out the weather. Floors that were rotting have been reinforced. The buildings are still ruins, but they are ruins that have been frozen in time, preserved in their decay. Hard hat tours now take visitors through these abandoned wards. You can walk the corridors where sick immigrants once waited to learn if they would live or die. You can stand in the rooms where families were separated, where deportation orders were issued, where hope ended for so many. Feel the weight of history around you. The contrast between the two sides of Ellis Island is striking. On the north side, the restored main building gleams with fresh paint and polished floors. Tourists crowd the exhibits, taking photographs, searching the databases for their ancestors' names. On the south side, silence reigns. The hospital buildings stand empty, their walls marked by water stains and peeling plaster, their corridors littered with debris that the preservationists have deliberately left in place. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. Some visitors find the south side more moving than the north. The restored main building, for all its historical significance, can feel like a museum, a place sanitized for public consumption. But the ruined hospital still feels haunted, still holds the raw emotion of all that happened there. There is something sacred about these abandoned spaces. The wards where children died of measles. The rooms where immigrants learned they could never enter America. The Psychopathic Ward, where those deemed mentally unfit were held until they could be shipped back across the ocean. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. In recent years, artists have tried to capture this haunting quality. A French artist named J.R. created installations in the hospital buildings, pasting enormous photographs of immigrants onto the walls and windows. Their faces stared out from the ruins, reminders of all the individual stories that these buildings contained. Other projects have recorded the oral histories of surviving immigrants, capturing their memories before they fade. The library at Ellis Island now holds thousands of hours of testimony, voices speaking in dozens of languages, telling stories of hope and heartbreak, success and failure. Time moves like honey as we consider what these voices tell us. The immigrants who passed through Ellis Island went on to build America. Their children and grandchildren fought in world wars, built businesses, created art, advanced science, shaped the culture of the nation. An estimated 40% of all Americans can trace at least one ancestor to this small island in the harbor. Irving Berlin, who wrote God Bless America and White Christmas, arrived at Ellis Island as a child from Russia. Albert Einstein, whose theories revolutionized physics, passed through on his way to Princeton. Felix Frankfurter, who would serve on the Supreme Court, came through as a 12-year-old from Austria. And millions of others whose names are not famous, but whose contributions were no less real. Factory workers and shopkeepers, farmers and teachers, nurses and carpenters. The ordinary people who did the ordinary work of building a nation. Picture yourself standing at the window of the registry room, looking out at the harbor. The water is gray today, reflecting the clouds that gather over the city. Ferries move back and forth, carrying tourists to and from the island. And somewhere in the distance, ships still enter the harbor, though they no longer carry the teeming masses that once came seeking freedom. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story of immigration to America did not end with Ellis Island. It continued through airports and border crossings, through detention centers and naturalization ceremonies, through all the ways that people have found to come to this country in search of something better. The debates continue too. Questions about who should be allowed in, about what it means to be American, about the balance between security and compassion. These are the same questions that were asked at Ellis Island a century ago, and they have never been fully resolved. But perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the questions themselves are more important than any final answer. Perhaps the ongoing negotiation between hope and fear, between welcome and exclusion, is simply part of what America is. Slowly, the scene shifts to the present moment. Today, Ellis Island stands as a monument and a mirror. It reflects what America was and what it might become. It reminds us of the courage of those who crossed oceans seeking freedom, and of the cruelty that sometimes greeted them when they arrived. The island holds both stories, the glory and the shame, the welcome and the rejection, the dreams that came true and the dreams that died. Close your eyes and see them all. The 17-year-old girl from Ireland stepping onto American soil for the first time. The family separated by a diagnosis of trachoma. The child who died of measles in the hospital far from home. The immigrant declared mentally deficient and shipped back across the ocean. The worker deported for attending the wrong political meeting. And the millions who made it through, who climbed those stairs, who answered those questions, who passed through that golden door and went on to build lives that their ancestors could never have imagined. Feel the weight of history around you. Their stories are not finished. They continue in their children and grandchildren, in the families that grew from those hopeful arrivals, in the nation that was shaped by their labor and their dreams. And somewhere in the salt air and the weathered brick, in the echo of footsteps on marble floors, those stories are still being told. The fog thickens over the harbor. The city lights begin to flicker through the mist, and Ellis Island settles into another night of memory and forgetting, of silence and whispers. Our final chapter waits, but for now, let yourself rest. The story will be here when you return. As you settle deeper into this moment, consider what it means to remember. The descendants of Ellis Island immigrants have created a wall of honor on the island. It contains the names of more than 700,000 immigrants whose families chose to commemorate their arrival. The names are inscribed on panels that circle a garden, a permanent memorial to those who came seeking something better. Picture yourself walking along that wall, name after name after name. Irish names and Italian names, Jewish names and Polish names, German names and Greek names. Names that have become American names, carried forward through generations, spoken now by people who may never have known the ancestor who first bore them. Each name represents a journey, a decision to leave home, a voyage across an ocean, a moment of judgment at an inspector's desk, and then, for most, the beginning of a new story in a new land. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The American Family Immigration History Center, located in the restored main building, allows visitors to search through the records of those who arrived. Manifest records, naturalization documents, photographs of the ships that carried immigrants across the sea. For many visitors, this is the real purpose of their trip, the chance to find concrete evidence of their family's passage through this place. The search can be surprisingly emotional. To see your great-grandmother's name written in a clerk's handwriting, to learn what village she came from, what occupation she listed, how much money she carried. To discover, perhaps, that she was detained for a day or a week before being admitted, and to wonder what she felt during that uncertain time. Slowly, the scene shifts to these moments of discovery. A woman finds the record of her grandfather's arrival and begins to cry. A man learns that his family changed their name not at Ellis Island, as family legend claimed, but years later when they applied for citizenship. A child, too young to understand,
watches as her parents trace their fingers over yellowed photographs.
These are the moments that give Ellis Island its power. Not the historical facts alone, but the personal connections that those facts enable. The sense of touching something that connects the present to the past, that makes ancestors real in a way that family stories alone cannot. Feel the weight of history around you. The museum exhibits tell the broader story, too. They explain the immigration laws and how they changed over time. They describe the inspection process, the medical examinations, the Board of Special Inquiry. They do not shy away from the darker aspects, the deportations and detentions, the prejudice and the suffering. But perhaps more importantly, they preserve the voices of the immigrants themselves. Recorded oral histories allow visitors to hear people describe their experiences in their own words. The fear of the inspection, the joy of reunion, the struggle to build a new life in an unfamiliar country. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. These voices are precious because so few remain. The last of the immigrants who came through Ellis Island during its peak years are nearly gone now. Their children are elderly. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was like to climb those stairs, to face those inspectors, to step through that door into America. But the stories will remain, preserved in recordings and documents, in photographs and family memories, in the very walls of this island that once held so many hopes and fears. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. There is a small ferry building on the south side of the island, near the hospital complex. It was here that most immigrants first stepped on to Ellis Island, disembarking from the barges that brought them from their transatlantic ships. And it was here that many of them last touched the island, boarding ferries to Manhattan to begin their new lives. The ferry building has been restored, but it is not open to the general public. It sits quietly, watching over the harbor, a witness to all the comings and goings that once defined this place. Picture yourself standing at that ferry landing. The water laps against the pilings. Across the harbor, Manhattan rises silver and gray against the sky. And in your imagination, you can see the ghosts of those who came before. Families clutching their belongings, children clinging to their parents' hands, young men and women alone, venturing into an unknown future. They are all here in the salt air and the restless water, in the echo of forgotten languages, in the memory of hope. Time moves like honey as we hold these images together. The story of Ellis Island is, in many ways, the story of America itself. A nation built by people who came from somewhere else. A history marked by both generosity and cruelty, by welcome and exclusion, by ideals that were not always honored but were never entirely abandoned. The island itself is a physical reminder of these contradictions. The grand main building, designed to process millions with efficiency and dignity. The hospital wards, where some found healing and others found only heartbreak. The detention cells, where the unwanted were held until they could be sent away. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. In the end, what remains is not a simple story, but a complex one. Not a celebration or a condemnation, but both at once. Ellis Island was a place of extraordinary possibility and extraordinary cruelty, often at the same time, often to the same people. The immigrants who passed through knew this better than anyone. They experienced the hope and the fear together, the chance of admission, and the threat of rejection. They understood that America was not simply a promised land, but a contested one, a place where dreams could come true, but were never guaranteed. Close your eyes and see them one last time. The tired and the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of teeming shores. They came in their millions, and most of them made it through. They became Americans. They built lives and raised families and died, eventually, as citizens of a country that had not always wanted them. And their descendants are here still, working and loving and dreaming, carrying forward the legacy of those brave enough to cross an ocean in search of something better. Feel the weight of history around you as we prepare for our final chapter. The fog has lifted slightly. The harbor lights are brighter now, and somewhere in the quiet of the evening, the island waits for what comes next. Soon we will complete our journey together. Soon we will say goodbye to these corridors and wards, to these ghosts and memories. But for now, let yourself rest in the stillness of this moment. The story is almost done, but the echoes will last forever. As you drift toward sleep, consider one more thing. Every person alive today is the result of countless journeys. Migrations across continents and oceans, over mountains and through deserts, from one place to another in search of safety, of opportunity, of love. Ellis Island is just one stopping point in the great human story of movement and change, but it is a significant one. Because here, in this small patch of land surrounded by harbor water, the modern American story began for so many millions. Here, the old world met the new. Here, identities were transformed, possibilities were opened, futures were determined. Picture yourself one last time on the island. The evening is quiet now. The last tourists have left on the final ferry. The rangers are making their rounds, checking doors and windows before the night fully settles in. And in the great registry room, the silence holds the weight of all who came before. The harbor water rises and falls with the tide. The distant lights of the city glitter like promises. And somewhere in that soft darkness, 12 million stories wait to be remembered. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. This has been a story of hope and heartbreak, of doors opened and doors closed, of dreams fulfilled and dreams denied. It has been a story of America as it was and as it might become, of the ongoing tension between who we want to be and who we actually are. But most of all, it has been a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, crossing oceans, starting over, building lives from nothing, believing, despite all evidence, that tomorrow could be better than today. That is the real legacy of Ellis Island. Not the buildings or the records or the exhibits, but the spirit that drove people to leave everything behind and start again. That spirit is still alive. It is carried forward in the descendants of those immigrants and in the new immigrants who continue to arrive, seeking the same things their predecessors sought. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Soon we will reach the end of our journey together. Soon the final chapter will unfold, bringing closure to all that has come before. But for now, let yourself rest in this moment of quiet. The island sleeps, the harbor is still, and the story waits. And so we come to the end. The harbor is quiet tonight. The ferries have stopped running. The museum is closed, its lights dimmed, its corridors empty of visitors. And Ellis Island rests in the soft darkness, holding its secrets the way it has for more than a century. Picture yourself here one last time. The brick towers rise against the night sky, their silhouettes familiar now after all the hours we have spent together. The windows of the registry room reflect the distant lights of Manhattan. And somewhere in the abandoned hospital wards, the ghosts of the past keep their silent vigil. Feel the weight of history around you as we complete our journey. We have walked these halls together. We have heard the voices of those who passed through, their hopes and their fears, their triumphs and their tragedies. We have seen the doctors with their chalk marks, the inspectors with their questions, the families torn apart by decisions made in seconds. And we have seen something else, too. The courage that brought people here, the resilience that carried them forward, the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today, if only they were brave enough to reach for it. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Ellis Island was not a perfect place. It was marked by the prejudices of its time, by assumptions about race and intelligence that we now know to be false. It excluded people who should have been welcomed. It separated families that should have stayed together. It broke hearts that deserved only kindness. But it was also a place where miracles happened, where 12 million people were given a chance to start over, where the hungry were fed and the sick were healed, where dreams, however improbable, sometimes came true. Time moves like honey as we hold these contradictions together one final time. The story of Ellis Island is not simple. It cannot be reduced to a tale of pure welcome or pure rejection, of unmixed good or unmixed evil. It was a place where human beings, with all their flaws and all their virtues, tried to manage an unprecedented challenge. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. And perhaps that is the most important lesson this island has to teach, that immigration is complicated, that borders are complicated, that questions of who belongs and who does not are never as simple as they seem. These questions require wisdom and compassion, qualities that are not always present when they are most needed. Slowly, the scene shifts to the present moment. Tonight, somewhere in the world, people are making the same decisions that the immigrants of Ellis Island made a century ago. They are leaving their homes, saying goodbye to everyone they know, setting out for places they have never seen. They are carrying their children across deserts and oceans, through checkpoints and camps, toward futures that remain uncertain. Their journeys are different from those of the Ellis Island era. They travel by different means, face different obstacles, encounter different systems of welcome and exclusion. But the fundamental impulse is the same, the hope that somewhere, somehow, life can be better. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. We are all immigrants, or the children of immigrants, or the grandchildren of immigrants. Even the longest settled peoples have ancestors who came from somewhere else. Movement is part of what it means to be human. The desire for something better is written into our nature. Ellis Island reminds us of this truth. It reminds us that the nation we call America was built by people who chose to come here, people who risked everything for a chance at freedom. Their courage made this country possible. Their labor built its cities and its railroads, its factories and its farms. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. The island stands today as a monument to that courage. The restored main building welcomes visitors from around the world, inviting them to trace their own family histories, to understand what their ancestors endured. The ruined hospital complex on the south side preserves the darker memories, refusing to let them be forgotten. Together, these two sides of Ellis Island tell a complete story: the glory and the shame, the welcome and the rejection, the lives that were saved and the lives that were lost. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. As our story comes to its end, let us remember one more thing. Every person who passed through Ellis Island was someone's child. They had parents who loved them, who hoped for them, who perhaps never saw them again. They had brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, communities that mourned their departure. And they came here anyway. They left everything they knew for the chance of something unknown. They walked into uncertainty with nothing but hope to guide them. Picture them now, all 12 million of them, standing in the great registry room, waiting to learn their fates, climbing the stairs while doctors watched from above, answering questions they did not always understand in languages they were still learning, holding their children close, praying that they would all be allowed to stay together. They are here still, in a way. Their spirits live on in the salt air and the weathered brick, in the echo of footsteps that have long since faded, in the stories that we tell about who they were and what they meant. Close your eyes and let yourself drift into that crowd. You are surrounded by faces from every corner of Europe and beyond. You hear languages you have never encountered before. You smell the wool of damp coats, the salt of the harbor, the faint trace of fear and hope mingled together. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be here, what it meant to leave everything behind, what it meant to stand at the threshold of a new world and wonder if you would be allowed to enter. Feel the weight of history around you one final time. This is your inheritance, whether your ancestors passed through this place or not. This story belongs to all of us. The courage that brought people here, the resilience that carried them forward, the dreams that sustained them through the hardest times. These are human qualities, shared by all who seek something better than what they have. Ellis Island reminds us of what we are capable of, both the cruelty and the kindness, both the exclusion and the welcome. It holds up a mirror to America and asks us to look honestly at what we see. And perhaps that honest looking is the best way to honor those who came before, to acknowledge the failures alongside the successes, to remember the rejected alongside the welcomed, to tell the whole truth about what this island was and what it meant. Breathe deeply one last time as we prepare to say goodbye. The harbor is dark now. The city lights have faded behind the fog, and Ellis Island sleeps the way it has slept for so many nights, keeping its vigil over the water, guarding its memories against the forgetting that time brings. Soon you will drift away from here, carried by sleep toward your own dreams. But something of this place will stay with you. The stories we have shared, the voices we have heard, the faces we have imagined, looking out at a skyline that held all their hopes. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And so we come to the very end. Thank you for walking these corridors with me. Thank you for listening to these voices from the past. Thank you for caring about what happened here, and for carrying these stories forward
into the future.
The immigrants who passed through Ellis Island are mostly gone now. The last of those who came during the peak years have passed away. But their legacy remains in the nation they helped build, in the families they raised, in the stories that continue to be told. You are part of that legacy too, by listening, by remembering, by holding these stories in your heart. You help to keep them alive. You become a link in the chain that connects past to present to future. And that is no small thing. Picture yourself one final time standing at the window of the registry room. The harbor stretches out before you, calm and dark. The Statue of Liberty raises her torch in the distance, just as she did when the first immigrants saw her from the decks of their ships. And all around you, the building holds its memories, waiting for the next generation of visitors to discover them. This is Ellis Island, island of hope, island of tears, gateway to America, home to 12 million dreams. Its story is not over. As long as there are people who remember, who visit, who care, the story continues. It changes and grows, taking on new meanings for new generations, reflecting whatever questions each era brings. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The island will be here when you wake. The stories will be waiting. The echoes will continue. Sleep now, and dream of all the journeys that have been, and all the journeys yet to come. The harbor is quiet, the night is deep, and Ellis Island rests at last. Good night. As you drift toward sleep, let us remember a few more of those who passed through this place. There was a young boy from Poland who arrived in 1905 with nothing but a photograph of his father and an address scrawled on a piece of paper. His father had come to America 3 years earlier, promising to send for the family when he had saved enough money. The boy did not recognize his father at first. He had grown so much, and his father had aged so much, that they stood facing each other like strangers until the older man began to weep. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. There was a woman from Italy who gave birth on the ship during a storm in the Atlantic. She named her daughter Maria after the Virgin, because she believed only divine intervention had saved them both. When she arrived at Ellis Island with the infant in her arms, the inspectors detained her until her husband could be located. He worked in a mine in Pennsylvania and did not receive word for 3 days. But he came. He always said afterward that those were the longest 3 days of his life. There was an old man from Russia who had survived a pogrom that killed most of his village. He arrived alone, his wife and children buried in unmarked graves thousands of miles away. The inspectors asked him who would be meeting him, and he said, no one. They asked him where he would go, and he said he did not know. They almost sent him back, but a charity worker intervened, finding him a place in a boarding house on the Lower East Side. He lived there for 30 years, working as a tailor, sending money back to distant relatives who had also survived. Slowly, the scene shifts to the patterns that these individual stories reveal. Most immigrants came in chains of family and community. One person would arrive first, find work, save money, and send for the next. Slowly, whole villages were transplanted from the old world to the new. Neighbors who had lived side by side in Italy or Poland found themselves living side by side again in New York or Chicago, recreating as much of their old lives as they could in their new homes. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away. These communities became the foundation of ethnic neighborhoods that still exist today. Little Italy and Chinatown, Polish Hill and Greek Town. The names remind us that American cities were built by people who came from somewhere else, who brought their languages and their foods and their traditions with them. The children of these immigrants often grew up between two worlds. They spoke one language at home and another at school. They ate different foods, celebrated different holidays, followed different customs depending on whether they were with family or with friends. This negotiation between old and new, between heritage and assimilation, became a defining feature of American life. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Some immigrants changed their names when they arrived, choosing something that sounded more American, that would be easier to spell and pronounce. Others kept their original names, but found that clerks and officials spelled them differently, that the names evolved over time into new forms. The myth persists that names were changed at Ellis Island by careless inspectors. In reality, the inspectors simply recorded what they found on the ship's manifest, which had been filled out at the port of departure. But names did change, through misunderstanding, through choice, through the gradual process of becoming American. Picture yourself in the currency exchange on the first floor of the main building. Immigrants lined up here to exchange their foreign money for American dollars. The exchange rates were posted on the wall, updated daily. For many, this was the moment when their old lives truly ended. The coins they had carried from home, bearing the faces of kings and emperors, were traded for bills bearing the faces of American presidents. Time moves like honey as we consider what was gained and what was lost. Something was always lost in immigration. Language, often. Connection to place, to community, to the landscape that had shaped a family for generations. The ability to visit the graves of ancestors, to celebrate holidays with extended family, to feel fully at home in one's surroundings. But something was gained, too. Opportunity, safety, the chance to build something new, the freedom to worship as one chose, to speak one's mind, to rise as high as talent and hard work could take you. These were not empty promises. For millions of immigrants, America delivered on its dream. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The balance sheet of immigration cannot be calculated precisely. The losses and the gains are too personal, too various, too dependent on individual circumstances. What one person experienced as liberation, another experienced as exile. What one family remembered as opportunity, another remembered as sacrifice. But perhaps that complexity is itself important. Perhaps it reminds us that immigration is not an abstraction, not a policy debate, not a set of statistics. It is millions of individual lives, each one unique, each one carrying its own burden of hope and fear. Close your eyes and see them one more time. The families huddled together in the registry room, the children clinging to their parents' hands, the young men and women alone, venturing into unknown futures, the elderly making one last journey, carrying the weight of all they were leaving behind. They are here still, in the brick and mortar of this island, in the salt air that blows in from the harbor, in the stories that have been passed down through generations. Feel the weight of history around you as our journey truly ends. We have traveled far together. From the first day Ellis Island opened its doors to the present moment when it stands as a monument and a memory. We have heard voices from across the years speaking of hope and heartbreak, of welcome and rejection, of dreams fulfilled and dreams denied. And now it is time to rest. The harbor is still. The city sleeps. And Ellis Island keeps its quiet vigil over the water, as it has for more than a century. as it will continue to do for as long as anyone remembers what happened here. You can let this moment blur softly. The story has been told. The voices have been heard. The memories have been honored. And now, sleep. Let the gentle rhythm of the tides carry you away from this place. Let the soft darkness of the harbor enfold you like a blanket. Let the stories we have shared settle into your dreams, becoming part of you, becoming part of the ongoing legacy of all who passed through this golden door. As you drift away, remember that you are connected to this place, whether your ancestors came through here or not. The story of Ellis Island is the story of human courage, of the willingness to leave everything behind for the chance of something better. That courage lives in all of us, waiting to be called upon when we need it most. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The immigrants who came through Ellis Island did not know what their futures would hold. They could not see the generations that would follow them, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would carry their blood and their memories forward through time. They could only take the next step, climb the next stair, answer the next question, trust that somehow things would work out, even when there was no evidence that they would.
That trust is a gift they left behind, a reminder that the future is always uncertain, but that we can face it anyway, that we can leave what we know for what we hope and survive the crossing. Picture the island one final time as morning begins to break. The first light touches the brick towers, turning them from gray to gold. The harbor water reflects the changing sky, and somewhere in the distance, the city begins to stir. Another day of dreams and struggles about to begin. This is America, built by dreamers, built by those who took chances, built by the tired and the poor and the huddled masses who believed, against all odds, that they could make something of themselves here. Their faith was not always rewarded. Their dreams did not always come true. But they came anyway. They tried anyway. And that trying is itself a kind of triumph. Feel the weight of history around you one last time.
You are part of this story now. By listening, by remembering, by carrying these voices forward, you have become a link in the chain that connects the past to the future. Somewhere, perhaps, an ancestor of yours stood in the registry room, waiting to learn their fate. Or perhaps your family came by a different route, at a different time, through a different door. It does not matter. The story belongs to all of us. Because Ellis Island is not just a place, it is an idea. The idea that people can start over, that old identities can be shed and new ones created, that where you come from matters less than where you are going. That idea is fragile. It needs to be protected, nurtured, remembered. And every time someone visits Ellis Island, every time someone tells these stories, every time someone listens, the idea grows a little stronger. Time moves like honey as we reach the very end. The story is complete now. We have walked the corridors together, heard the voices, seen the faces. We have honored those who came before and acknowledged both the welcome they received and the cruelty they endured. What remains is silence. The good kind of silence, full of meaning and memory. The kind of silence that holds everything we have experienced together, keeping it safe until we need it again. You can let this moment blur softly. The story will always be here, waiting for you to return. Breathe deeply one last time. The fog has lifted. The stars are visible now, the same stars that guided ships across the Atlantic, the same stars that the immigrants saw when they stood on deck, wondering what their futures would hold. Those stars are still there, and so are you. And so are the stories. Good night, and thank you for listening. If this story helped you drift toward sleep, if it gave you something to dream about, we would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these journeys through history, these quiet explorations of the past that are designed to carry you gently into rest. And if you have a story about your own family's journey to America, we would love to hear it. Leave a comment below and share your heritage. You are part of this history too. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with hope.